Hello everyone, my name is Alex Toon and I'm the Executive General Manager for Commodities, Trade and Carbon here at CBA. At the Commonwealth Bank, we have a critical role to play in assisting the development of the future leaders of our country. As one of Australia's largest companies, we are proud to be a founding sponsor of the John Monash Foundation, investing in the education and research of emerging thought leaders. Supporting postgraduate study is an important tool to help foster leadership, expertise, as well as building Australia's capabilities for the future. Research and applying those learnings in practice is a wonderful example of this program, and I'm delighted to welcome CommBank's 2022 John Monash Scholar Timothy Rownes today to discuss his research across the energy sector. Tim, it's great to have you here in person, and we're thrilled that you can sit down and discuss your research and scholarship with the John Monash Foundation.
Thanks, Alex.
Firstly, can you tell us a little bit about your study to date and how you became involved with the John Monash Foundation?
Yeah, so I can give a bit about my background and then talk about sort of where we're going with the scholarship. So I studied mechanical engineering and physics here in Australia at UNSW, and I joined the ANSTO's Graduate Development Program. So ANSTO is the Australian Nuclear Science Technology Organisation, 20 k's to the south of Sydney, and they operate Australia's only nuclear reactor. That's a research reactor that makes nuclear medicine and neutron beams for science. And on the Graduate Development Program, I got to get into nuclear reactor operations and worked in engineering, and I qualified as a nuclear reactor operator. And I worked there for 7 years in the control room as a reactor operator and a shift manager. In 2017, I attended the World Nuclear University Summer Institute in Uppsala, just north of Stockholm in Sweden, and I found out about a new nuclear project on the west coast, about in the middle of Finland. In Pyhäjoki, that's the Hanhikivi 1 nuclear power plant. And so when I got back to Australia, I looked up the website, applied online, did some Skype interviews, and I got the job. So I moved to Helsinki, and that project's been in the licensing and design phase for the past 4 years where I've been there. So the first 11 years of my career's basically been fairly technical. I've been very much focused on one industry and one sector, that's nuclear science and technology and reactor operations. And at this point in my career, it's becoming pretty clear that Australia and other economies really need to do something about achieving net zero by 2050. The IPCC reports are really clear, and lots of companies are making big commitments to reduce emissions. So I considered the impact that I could make in just this one field and just this one power plant compared to the potential impact I could make in the future across a whole number of sectors going forward. So that's why I wanted to round out the technical skill set with more general business skills, and that's why I've applied to study an MBA at INSEAD in Fontainebleau. That's one of the world's best business schools, and I've been fortunate to receive a John Monash Scholarship supported by CommBank for that.
Great. So as you touched on, the transition to net zero and the climate challenge we have ahead of us, what have your learnings or experience been, and how do you think we can apply them potentially here in Australia? Is there a role for nuclear energy here? Yeah,
so about the transition to net zero, I think I grew up in Kempsey on the mid-north coast of Australia, and during the 90s we had a drought, early 2000s, big flood, and we're starting to see more and more of those extreme climate events, drought, fire or floods in the past few years. It's becoming really clear the impact that increasing CO2 is having on the environment here in Australia. And in different countries have chosen different paths to decarbonise the grid. So Finland's grid is already 80% decarbonised. And they've done that. They run about 40% nuclear as part of their overall energy mix, which includes wind, not so much solar because it's pretty extreme north and it gets quite dark in the winter. But quite a few countries have really successfully, already in the 70s and the 80s, decarbonised their grid. France has done it, Sweden as well, and they did that with a pretty large rollout of nuclear fleet. Is nuclear appropriate for Australia? Well, it kind of depends. I think the big two concerns people have about nuclear technology are about how safe is it and what do we do with the waste? And
Yes.
those conversations are absolutely crucial, and the industry, I think, really needs to be upfront about that and communicate clearly that something like waste siting needs to be part of the discussion already when we're discussing should we introduce this as a power source. And unfortunately, like it's taken a very long time for different countries to come to grips with dealing with their nuclear waste, because it's a difficult conversation to have. What do we do with this stuff that's hazardous for the next 100,000 years or so? And it's been good for me to see the experience in Finland because they're basically the only place that's really done it successfully. They've had a competitive process to site a deep geological waste store, and they came up with a technology that they're fairly certain is going to hold the waste safely for the next 100, 200,000 years. It's called Posiva, it's on the west coast, and that will be coming into operation soon. But it's taken a very long time, and it's a difficult sell with the public to say, we'll start something now and we'll deal with the waste later. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. But it's an absolutely well-proven way of taking CO2 out of the grid pretty rapidly, and it's dispatchable power as well.
Yes. And we've obviously now got a focus also on energy security in addition to clean energy. And we're seeing examples of Germany extending the life of some of their nuclear facilities. So to your point on safety, what's changed in the last few years, decades, to improve the safety of nuclear?
Yeah, I'd say one of the nice things about the nuclear industry is continuous improvement. It's been built in to the industry, especially over the last 30 years, is that all of the power plants are members of the World Association of Nuclear Operators, which was created after Chernobyl, to make sure that we have designs that can't go wrong in the ways that they've gone wrong before. So there's all of the nuclear regulators in each country put a really strong emphasis on the licensees, that's the operators at the power plants, to learn from not only the events that happen at their own plants, but from other plants. And one technology that's starting to be rolled out now is small modular reactors. And in terms of safety, it just means that the size of the source, the core, isn't as big as the current larger power plants. So the exclusion zone around the plant doesn't need to be quite so large. Not to mention there's an increasing focus on passive safety systems. So that's systems that don't rely on external power to do what they need to do to keep removing heat from the fuel once the reactor's shut down. Finally, there's design for systems that anticipate if there's something we haven't taken into account and something does go wrong, that we're ready in case something like that that's like a core catcher, for example, that we don't expect that we're ever going to have to use it, but if the fuel does get too hot and it melts, then the containment and the core catcher are designed to retain all of the fission products so that there's no release outside of the plant boundary.
Right. And you mentioned you're about to go to INSEAD, a fantastic institution. I've had the pleasure of visiting and walking around the campus there in Fontainebleau, so I'm very jealous. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your MBA or your studies at INSEAD.
Yeah, so the aim of the MBA, I think, my experience, as I said before, has been just within the nuclear industry and just within nuclear reactor operations, and I want to be able to have a bigger impact. And the MBAs, it's basically two things. It's the institutional learning and the network. So about the institutional learning, it's about the strategy skills, looking at different business cases, how the world works, looking at how things have gone well or wrong in the past and how we can do business effectively in the future. And INSEAD's great. They do a ton of research as well into best practices around the world. So they're a real hub for where is business going forward. And then, yeah, about the network, I've been to lots of conferences, but they've all been nuclear conferences. So I haven't interacted with, like, even within the John Monash Scholarship event we had in Canberra recently, the whole group of scholars, they're from all different types. There's lawyers, public policy people, doctors, and that's a similar kind of cohort that you'll see at a business school. So it's an opportunity to get, I think, diverse perspectives and to learn and create connections in that kind of environment. And that's something I hear from people who've been to business school, is that before doing the MBA, they never had any idea what effect it would have on them and how much it would change what they would want to do in the future.
Yes, yes. And obviously with topics like nuclear energy and the transition to net zero, very complicated topics. How do you see those networks? You give the example of nuclear attending conferences.
Yeah.
How in the nuclear industry, how does that work with people from different countries, different backgrounds? Maybe you give us a bit of an insight of what happens in some of those conferences, what the discussions are, what are the key topics that people are focused on?
Yeah, so nuclear industry conferences, so the way it kind of works internationally is that since about the past 20 years or so, a lot of countries around the world have a young generation in nuclear network. This is a response to most of the plants were built in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of the people who built them started to retire, and there needed to be a kind of knowledge transfer to younger people, and that was sort of the impetus for creating these groups to share knowledge and information in different countries. And obviously the countries with big nuclear fleets like France or the US or the UK have really large and active local networks. Aside from the local networks, there are regional ones as well. So every 2 years is the European Nuclear Young Generation Forum, that's somewhere in Europe. And in alternate 2 years, there's the International Youth Nuclear Congress, which is all of representatives from around the world, different companies, come and attend. It's usually 400 or 500 people in a different continent every time. The most recent one was here in Sydney. And yeah, some colleagues and I formally founded the Australian Young Generation in Nuclear, and I organised the first annual general meeting, which elected this executive committee, and they led the bid to host, and we held it at the ICC here in Sydney. Yeah, and it's a terrific opportunity to just see, like, Australia's only the one nuclear facility at ANSTO, which does great work, but they don't do power generation, and that's something you can learn a lot about, or what's happening in the fusion field, for example, and there's a lot of private investment going into fusion at the moment too, yeah.
Okay, and that's a really interesting topic on its own. Maybe it'd be great to hear your thoughts on fusion and the innovation there.
Yeah, there's lots of different, lots of money being invested into fusion at the moment. There's billions of dollars going into startups in the US especially. Looking at the typical fusion setup is this tokamak, and that's what's being built at ITER in Cadarache in France, the big project that it's like a test, proof of concept to figure out how fusion is going to work. ITER, in terms of power generation, is still quite a long way away, maybe 15 years at least.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the concepts now that are seeing private investment are aiming at much more ambitious dates, I think I'm not an expert on fusion, but it does remain to be seen, like, to see the data. Like, it's a tremendously promising area, but we definitely want to see that they can deliver on the marketing at the moment. Yeah.
Right, and congratulations, you recently joined Bain in Helsinki. Perhaps tell us a little bit about that work and what you're looking forward to doing after you finish INSEAD.
Sure. So that's actually something that's come out of a conference. And in terms of career, for anyone who's listening, I guess one thing I can really recommend is just try and go to conferences, because that's where you can meet and make connections. And networking sounds boring, but it's just about meeting people and making connections, especially outside of the usual conference schedule. But yeah, one of my friends from these international youth nuclear conferences went to INSEAD, and actually I had a couple of friends who went to INSEAD and joined Bain after the MBA. And while I was applying for the Monash Scholarship and for the MBA, I just shot him a message and like, hey, I wonder if you could tell me a bit about INSEAD. And so we chatted about that, and then he was like, hey, you know what, if you wouldn't mind applying for Bain, they're hiring. So that's how I sort of got into the coffee chat, and learned all about case interviewing. That's a whole thing, but yeah, it's terrific. So you really never know where these connections you make at conferences or networking events are going to take you. And when I'll be working with Bain, well, the good thing about that and related to the MBA is it's a more general role. So they don't have nuclear in the portfolio, at least in the Nordics. So I'll be assigned to different areas, and that's, as I mentioned before with the MBA, I think a real opportunity to learn how the world works, whether it's in energy sustainability or in consumer products, and that'll be really useful knowledge, I think, going forward to see what the best businesses are doing.
Yes. Tim, what would your advice be to anybody watching or listening as far as postgraduate study?
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth doing. I had the opportunity while I was working shifts at ANSTO as a reactor operator. I was UNSW in Sydney started the nuclear engineering training program, so I was able to do that part-time in addition to work. I remember doing the exams for that and thinking, no, I'll never do any more postgraduate study. But I think, and here I am doing the MBA, it's definitely worthwhile. Like, the nuclear engineering master's degree that I got was what allowed me to get this job that I've had for the past 4 years in Finland. And my interest in the MBA was what got me the role with Bain that's coming up now, and this scholarship opportunity. So I would say definitely think about where your careers come from and where you want to be in the next 10 or 20 years from now, and how you can use education to achieve that.
Right. And we have as part of my business, a big focus on carbon and carbon markets and the use of market pricing through the transition.
Yeah.
Through your experience in the nuclear industry or through your studies, do you have any personal views on the areas that we need to see innovation to really help drive this transition?
I think definitely a recognition of the value. The nuclear industry has always been trying to advocate for how the plants can contribute to grid stability and dispatchable generation. So in addition to the recognition of, like, the inclusion of nuclear in as a recognised low carbon source in a trading mechanism, some kind of recognition for being able to dispatch the power, so that when there are lulls in the renewable generation, that there's another source that's low carbon that's able to make up for it.
Yes, okay. Great. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today at CBA, and good luck at INSEAD.
Thanks so much, Alex. Cheers.
Thank you.